Hello, Skoll World Forum 2022 attendees. Welcome to the closing plenary. In the past 2 days, thousands of us have come together to take part in roundtable conversations, panel discussions, and virtual meetups. We've shared ideas, knowledge, and strategies, and thanks to your enthusiastic participation, we've connected with each other around the world. Our closing plenary starts with a performance from Deavere Smith, the award-winning actor, playwright, and professor who has played characters on shows like Nurse Jackie and The West Wing. But it's Anna's independent theatre work that has gained her so many fans. Her one-woman shows are legendary. Drawing on her talents as a mimic, Anna tells people's stories in a very specific way, and she plays every character, regardless of their gender or ethnicity. Anna, welcome to the Skoll World Forum.
Hi, my name is Anna Deavere Smith, and I'm an actor. And my work that I've been doing for a long time, really my entire adult creative life, is trying to learn about America word for word. And let me tell you what I mean by that. When I was a girl, my grandfather said, if you say a word often enough, it becomes you. This is when I was growing up in Baltimore, Maryland, which was a de facto segregated town. If you say a word often enough, it becomes you. And when I went to the conservatory and learned some things about language and identity, mostly from studying classics, Shakespeare in particular, I started to wonder if there was a way to learn about people and American people by studying how they spoke, not just what they said, but how they spoke. And so I started going around America with a tape recorder and talking to people, usually in times of discord and conflict. Because I think when people are trying to make sense of something that's not right, something that's unjust or a catastrophe. So, for example, I went to 2 riots. I made a play about healthcare. I made a play about the school to prison pipeline based on hundreds and hundreds of interviews. When something's not right, people actually, as they speak, try to make sense of it, try to make it right. And they do things linguistically that make it easy for me to do a portrayal for them on stage, which at least engages the audience. And one of those plays that I wrote was about the subject of grace. And while writing it, I found out about a very interesting thing that had happened to the late Congressman John Lewis. It turned out that Congressman Lewis was a very good friend of my dear friend, Republican Congressman Amory Houghton. And so Amo found out, got in touch with John Lewis's office, and I'll never forget, I was at the Four Seasons in Washington, just about to get into the swimming pool, and I got a call that Congressman Lewis could see me right now. So I raced across town, and thank goodness I had, well, a tape recorder actually with me. Now just an iPhone would be fine. And I believe it was either in 2013 or 14 that I sort of dashed into his office and had him tell me about this moment of grace in American history. And so I'm now going to share that with you word for word. If you say a word often enough, it becomes you. Word for word from our great American hero, the late Congressman John Lewis. And this is called Brother. I do think that when people speak in these ways, parts of what they say in the course of, say, an hour that I talk to them is deserves a title. So this is John Lewis, and this is called Brother. On our way on this trip that we've been taking for the past 13 years. I've been going back every year since 1965, back to Selma to commemorate the anniversary of Bloody Sunday that took place on March 7, 1965. But we usually stop in Birmingham for a day, and then we go to Montgomery for a day, and then we go to Selma. But on this trip to Montgomery, We stop at First Baptist Church. It's the church that was pastored by Reverend Ralph Abernathy. It's the same church where I met Dr. Martin Luther King and Reverend Abernathy in the spring 1958. Young police officer, the chief, came to the church to speak on behalf of the mayor that was not available. And it gave a very moving speech to the audience. The church was full, Black, white, Latino, Asian Americans, members of Congress, staffers, family members, children, and grandchildren. And it said, what happened in Montgomery 52 years ago during a freedom ride when you arrived was not right. Said the police department didn't show up. They allowed an angry mob to come and beat you. And he said, Congressman, I'm sorry. What happened? I want to apologize. This is not the Montgomery that we want Montgomery to be. This is not the police department I want to be the chief on. Before any officers are hired, he said to go through training. They have to study the life of Rosa Parks. They have to study the life of Martin Luther King Jr. They have to visit the historic sites of the movement. They have to know what happened in Birmingham and what happened in Montgomery and what happened in Selma. He said, I want you to forgive us. He said, to show the respect that I have for you and for the movement, I want to take off my badge and give it to you. The church was so quiet. No one said a word. And I stood up to set the badge. And I started crying. And everybody in the church started crying. It was not a dry eye in the church. And I said, officer, chief, I cannot accept your badge. I am not worthy to accept your badge. Don't you need it? He said, Congressman Lewis, I can get another one. I want you to have my badge. And I took it. And I'm never ever going to forget. I'm going to hold on to it forever. But he hugged me. And I hugged him. I cried some more. You had Democrats and Republicans in the church crying. Young Black deputy assistant was sitting down. He was crying so hard like a baby, really couldn't even stand. It was the first time that any police officer in any city where I was arrested during the 60s ever apologized of where I was beaten. It was a moment of grace. It's a moment of reconciliation. It means that the suffering and the pain, and the chief was very young. He wasn't even born 52 years ago, but he was offering apology to be forgiven on behalf of his associates, his colleagues of the past. It's a moment of grace. It's a moment of reconciliation. It means that the suffering and the pain that so many people had suffered has been redeemed. And then for the police officer, the chief, to come and apologize, it felt so freeing and so good and so liberating, and to have this young man come up, he hugged me, he held me, and I felt like, I'm just one. I'm not worthy. I'm just one. I'm just one of the people, because many people were beaten. It's yes, it's amazing. It's Amazing Grace. You know that song, Amazing Grace. You know it. You do. Amazing Grace. Yeah, you know that line in there, so save a wretch like me. Save a wretch like me. A sinner, since it said we all falling short. We all just trying to make it. We all searching. Like Dr. King say, we out to redeem the soul of America. We first had to redeem ourselves. But this message, this act of grace of the badge, says to me, hold on. Never give up. Never give in. Never lose faith. Keep the faith. He's a very, very interesting man. It take what I call raw courage for a city like Montgomery. For this young man, it take what I call raw courage to go with his soul, to go with his heart, to go with. I think about calling him up and saying, "Hello, how you doing?" Only time something like this happened before was member of the Klan in Rock Hill, South Carolina, who beat me and my seatmate on May 9th, 1961. His son had been encouraging his father to seek out the people that he had wronged. And he came here right in office, February 09. I said, Mr. Lewis, I'm one of the people who beat you on May 9th, 1961. I won't apologize. Will you forgive me? I said, I forgive you. I accept your apology. But he hugged me. His son hugged me. He started crying. His son started crying. And I seen that guy several times since then. He called me brother. I call him brother.
"12 months ago, the World Trade Organization welcomed a new Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. It was an historic appointment for the WTO. Dr. Ngozi is the first woman and the first African to lead the organization. When she stepped into her new role, we were a year into the COVID pandemic. Global economies were floundering, and some wealthy countries were being criticized for hoarding vaccines. Dr. Ngozi's background as a world-class economist who's worked in development for over 30 years was solid preparation for dealing with global crises. She joins us to talk about her challenging work and approach to leadership in a conversation with James Mwangi, Skoll Foundation board member and executive director of the Dalberg Group.
have the honor of serving on the Skoll Foundation board, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you here today, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, in your role as Director General of the World Trade Organization. Welcome and hello.
Thank you.
You happen to sit in an unenviable position at a time of unprecedented global disruptions in the global trade system. You stepped into your role in the midst of a historic pandemic, and the disruptions to the trade system have continued with conflicts around the world, most recently that currently ravaging Ukraine. How do you think about the role of the World Trade Organization and the global trade system in protecting the most vulnerable from the ravages of these disruptions?
Well, thank you very much. You're absolutely right. This is an unprecedented time. First, we had the disruptions arising from the pandemic and the snafus with the global supply chains of so many products that has been leading to delays in getting products, rise in prices, inaccessibility even for small and medium enterprises and for poorer countries to global supply chains. So that had already been difficult. Inflationary pressures arising from all of this in many countries around the world. And then you layer onto that just what you said, the crisis of the war in Ukraine has added onto these disruptions. Because you now have rising energy prices and rising food prices. And you know that in the budgets of many households, the two biggest items are both energy prices and food prices. So this crisis will be hitting. Yes, we should all be very mindful that Ukraine is bearing the brunt of what is happening now, and it's a heart-wrenching situation. We hope that there'll be peace very soon, and we should all rally around the people of Ukraine. But we also, you've pointed to a very important issue, which is that these disruptions in supply chains will be hitting or are hitting very vulnerable countries and vulnerable populations within these countries. Now, we are also noticing some phenomena related to trade, and this is where the trade and the WTO can be quite instrumental and supportive. First of all, the biggest antidote to helping vulnerable populations right now is keeping the multilateral trading system open and trading and level and keeping supply chains open. Many people don't think about trade this way, but trade is actually an instrument for resilience. So when you have supplies cut off from one part of the world, trade makes it possible to take supplies from another part of the world to where they are needed. So the role we can play now is to make sure our rules are in place that the level playing field for the trading system is respected. So we are trying to work on that and ensure that monitoring supply chains so that they stay open both for inputs and outputs, the food and the energy supplies that countries need.
You have written and spoken often about what the COVID-19 pandemic revealed about the inequities of global health. As we speak now, the rich world largely seems to be putting the worst of this pandemic behind us. In other parts of the world, Africa and elsewhere, we are seeing a respite and we're hoping for the best, but vaccination rates and access to health commodities are uneven around the world. As we reflect on COVID-19 and also prepare for future pandemics, drawing on your own experience, not just in this role, but as former chair of Gavi, as a former minister and a public servant in a range of roles, what needs to be done to ensure a more equitable global response to future challenges to global health?
Well, thank you. That is actually a critical question. And what I want to say is that we mustn't forget that the crisis of the pandemic is still on. I mean, yes, we are rightly focusing on the war in Ukraine now, the really terrible situation there, but the pandemic is still another war that we are facing. First of all, let me say that in this pandemic, there are one or two things that I'm actually quite proud that we've been able to do at the WTO, and that the trading system has been able to do. Whilst overall trade contracted in 2020, for instance, we saw that trade in medical supplies and goods actually increased by 16% in value. What does this mean? It means that the trading system helped to take goods again, from where they were made to places where they were needed, hence the increase in the value of goods traded. And that meant that the trading system was part of the resilience and response system. Secondly, many WTO members had actually put in export restrictions on inputs and outputs related to the pandemic. When I first took the job in March last year, there were about 119 export restrictions and prohibitions. I can tell you today we are down to 35. And a great effort has been made by WTO members to bring this down. Finally, let me just touch on the issue of decentralized manufacturing of vaccines. Because what we noticed during this pandemic is that the manufacturing and export of vaccines is highly concentrated. 80% of the world's export of vaccines comes from 10 countries. And what we've tried to do here is work with the CEOs of vaccine manufacturers, the top 10 worldwide, to encourage them. If we are working with them on their supply chains, perhaps they could invest in decentralized manufacturing capacity. This is happening in Africa. As you know, African presidents have also been quite forthcoming and really proud of what they've done to try and attract these investments to the continent. So that's something that we've been actively pushing from behind. Lastly, intellectual property. I think everyone knows that there's been a very, very strong negotiations, debate going on here at the WTO about the waiver of intellectual property so that poorer countries can manufacture, have access to the patent. This is something for the past 3 months that my staff here, we've been trying to work on quietly behind the scenes to get 4 key countries to see if they could come up with some ideas that other members could look at. And that has happened now. We need to take it to the entire membership. We need even those countries to confirm that their governments are behind this. Then we take it to the entire membership, and then hopefully we'll have an IP framework that will work not just for this pandemic, but for the next one.
Indeed. As we think about tackling big global challenges, none looms larger than the challenge of human-caused climate change. You have talked about the reality, and we all know that the poorest countries, including countries in Africa, where we are both from, have done the least to cause it and are feeling the biggest brunt. And yet you've taken a different view in some of your writings that really spoke to me, which is that Africa, in addition to being, of course, a major vulnerable and affected part of the world from a climate perspective, could have a leading role to play in leading a climate response. How do you see that playing out, and how might that play out through the global trading system and other parts of the global system to shift Africa's role from climate victim to potentially climate vanguard?
Yes, I strongly believe in looking for opportunities within challenges. And I see in the challenge of climate change, which is probably one of the most existential challenges we face today, an opportunity for the continent. I know it sounds strange because as of 2021, we contributed 4% to global carbon emissions, which is very low. But if you look at the incidence of weather-based disasters and climate change challenges, droughts, floods, the continent is really clearly in the eye of the storm on this issue. And that affects food availability and the land and all sorts of things. So one could take that kind of a lens to it. But I prefer to look at it a bit differently and say, if you look, by many estimates, 2/3 of the continent's infrastructure is yet to be built. We know that a significant percentage of people on the continent have no access to electricity. This presents an opportunity. Electricity, roads, ports, so many pieces of infrastructure are not there. What does that mean? Rather than replicating the infrastructure with the same mistakes that have been made by the rich countries, we could be a leader in trying to put in place new infrastructure with low carbon emission potential. So we are good for solar, we are good for wind on the continent. And I'm actually proud to say the largest solar farm today is in Morocco. We also have some of the more preserved forests in the world, in the Congo and other parts. We are also a carbon sink. People talk of the Amazon, they forget that we have potential to be a good carbon sink. But for all of these things to happen, we need incentives. We need that $100 billion a year promised by the developed countries to materialize, so we can invest. And this is a question of trust. So the rich countries must make good on this, and they must support us for a just transition to a low carbon development pathway.
Stirring indeed. As in closing, you have held a range of firsts throughout your career. The first woman or the first African or both in a range of roles in Nigeria and beyond. Any reflections from you to the Skoll community on how we can think about continuing to build a more diverse leadership and a more inclusive leadership for the world?
Well, thank you. It's very sobering, actually, when you think about this series of firsts. I just want to say it doesn't really make me happy to be the first this, the first woman this, because it means we're not making progress in this day and age. I will be much happier when I'm not described as the first to do this and the first to do that. And people often ask what has been my experience. I think the lesson I've learned is that focusing on my strengths, where I have on jobs that I actually enjoy doing. I'm focusing on that, and I'm someone who is happiest when I feel I'm doing a job that is serving others. So my entire career has been built on policy at the large level. That's what I like. How can I make change in a bigger way, either at home through policy making, as I was in finance and foreign affairs, or in international organizations where you can affect policy that changes the lives of so many. Imagine the multilateral trading system. If you could make that work better for poor people and poor countries, that's huge. So the lessons learned is focus on what you like to do, train for it, and then try to seek jobs there that really make you want to get up in the morning and go to work. And if you do that, chances are you will be able to make progress. Nevertheless, I want to say that if women are to make progress, men must also learn to open the way. Men play a critical role in whether women make progress or not. And I often advise women, if you're seeking mentors, don't only look to other women, also look to men. As at now, they are controlling a lot of the places where women cannot get into. And I want them to hear this message. You need to get out of the way a little bit so that women can have a chance.
Heard very loud and clear. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, thank you so much for taking this time to speak to the Skoll community during what must be a hectically busy time. And we appreciate your time with us today and all of your wise words.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you. And thanks to the Skoll community. Thank you for what you're doing to support the world and make it a better place.
Thank you.
I have a statistic for you. 84 million. That's the number of people in the world forced to flee their homes, according to the UNHCR. They abandon their lives in countries like Syria, Yemen, Myanmar, South Sudan, Nigeria, Ukraine, to name just a few hotspots around the world where communities are being displaced. As a journalist, I spend a lot of time thinking about how to continue to tell refugee stories so we never stop caring as an international community. The Oscar-nominated Danish director Jonas Boje Rasmussen uses the powerful medium of film to connect us to the refugee experience. Jonas joins us now to talk about the animated documentary film Flee and why he made it.
Prøv en lille smule længere op. Meget lidt. Ja, lidt ned igen. Sådan der. Perfekt. Sådan der. Jeg skal også lige gøre sådan her. Så hvis du ligesom lukker øjnene nu. Ja. Og prøver at trække vejret sådan dybt ind. Lidt. Og bare slappe helt af. Har du nogensinde fortalt din livshistorie før?
Nej.
Men du er okay med at fortælle den til mig? Nu?
Ja.
Så tænker jeg på, om du kan ikke fortælle mig noget nu, men bare prøv at tænke tilbage på sådan dit tidligste minde. Altså, hvad er det tidligste, du sådan kan huske? Flea is an animated documentary about a very dear friend of mine who I met when I was 15 and he was 16. I clearly remember the first time I saw him in. It was on the train. We didn't have a lot of refugees or immigrants around at the time. There was a Somali family in town, but otherwise none. And Amin was very fashionably dressed. People in general didn't really care about fashion in that area, so he stood out there on the train. And I thought to myself, man, that guy looks cool. And he learned Danish really, really fast. And we started meeting up at the bus stop every morning, going to high school, and slowly became very good friends. And I already back then was curious about how and why he had come, but he didn't want to talk about it. I of course respected that, but this story of his past kind of became this black box in our friendship and within him. That is until 9 years ago, where Amin finally decided it was time to open up and start sharing his testimony with me so that I could pass it on to the world. I personally was interested in telling Amin's story, first and foremost because he's my friend, but of course also because I could see there was a bigger story to tell and something to learn from.
The Soviet transport circles quickly downward, firing magnesium flares to divert any heat-seeking missiles. American armed anti-Soviet mujahideen guerrillas are in the mountains around the city.
Vi ved, at den afghanske militær er ikke stærk nok til at holde de der Taliban væk. Så det er bare et spørgsmål om tid, hvornår de invaderer Kabul. Vi er klar over, at når mujahideen overtager, så skal der hævnes. Det vil straffe folk, som de mente var vantro.
Amin!
Vi skal ud. Det er nu. Så vi pakker vores ting, og vi når ikke sælge noget.
Amin, bio.
Så I når lige ud?
Vi er sådan lige i kammeret lige før det hele starter.
With what happened in Afghanistan last summer and in Ukraine these last months, Amin's story has unfortunately become sadly relevant again, and the importance trying to understand the refugee experience is more important than ever. Refugees are often just portrayed by what they need and not as the individuals they are, with complex psychologies like the rest of us. My hope with Flea is that I, by telling the story based on my personal friendship with Amin, can help to show that this big group of refugees consists of individuals, each with their own face and their own story. A story we can all relate to. Being a refugee is not an identity, but a life circumstance, and something that could happen to all of us. My own grandmother was born a refugee in my hometown, Copenhagen. As a daughter of a Jewish family on the run from persecution in Russia, she was born in a hotel next to the main railway station. She applied for asylum in Denmark, but they were rejected and fled on to Germany, where my grandmother grew up in Berlin. During her school years, she had to stand up in class with a yellow star on her chest every day, and soon after, my family had to flee again. Many years later, she met my grandfather, a French Catholic who grew up in extreme poverty in eastern France, and as a 13-year-old was sent to West Africa to work in the colonies because my great-grandparents could not feed their children. Both of my grandparents were affected by the traumas of their childhood and adolescence throughout their life, but that was not their identity.
Der går nogle dage. står der og kigger på deres skib, hvor jeg lige pludselig ikke kan mærke det der glæde.
Hvad er der galt?
Jeg var flov. Jeg tror, jeg var flov og skammede mig over vores situation. Folk vil gerne hoppe og svømme til det der skib. Så det var... De troede, hvis de hoppede i vandet og svømmede, så ville de blive hentet af det der skib. Det var lidt sådan... Alle var desperate, og... Så er det der fantastisk mulighed, at lige pludselig... At det de fleste, som ville opnå, var lige der, og man kunne ligesom lige række hånd og nå det.
Sinks its rusty hooks in my skin.
We have called the stolen border police. They're on their way. They will take you back. We have called the stolen border police. They're on their way. They will take you back.
When I did the first interview with Amin, he said it was important for him not to feel like a victim. What he has experienced will mark him forever, but he's come through it and has created a good life for himself and his husband and his family. When Amin arrived in Denmark in the 90s, after 5 years of flight, he was told that he was safe in Denmark. And this gave him the opportunity to start building a new life for himself, get an education, connect with the country and the people who live there. I've always been proud of coming from Denmark and Scandinavia for exactly that reason, because of this sense of trust in our society. Trust in the system and trust in each other, trust between friends and trust in a minor, unaccompanied refugee. We trust each other and believe that when we give something away, it'll come back. And these are the values that have given Amin the opportunity to go from being a refugee to being a human being. And those values are under pressure these years, in Denmark, in Scandinavia, and around the world. When you talk about refugees today, it often becomes a discussion about who is for and who's against refugees. But no one is really for refugees, least of all refugees themselves. It's important that we continue to turn towards each other and try to understand people who we wouldn't normally identify with. It's very much in the way we talk and the stories we tell. As a film director, or as a journalist, or as a politician, we need to try to see the nuances and stop defining people merely by the situation they're in. What we see right now, and I've been seeing these last years, we call a refugee crisis or a migrant crisis. But by doing that, we distance ourselves from what it really is. It's a humanitarian crisis, a human crisis, and it needs to be treated as such. We need to tell stories and talk so that people understand how showing trust in our fellow human beings gives value for all of us. We all need to listen more, share more, and make room for everyone to find a home in the world.
Hvad betyder ordet hjem for dig?
Et hjem er noget, som er trygt. Det er noget, som man ved, at man skal være her, at man skal ikke videre. At det ikke er noget, som er midlertidigt.
We go from one refugee's story to looking at human rights on a global scale with Michelle Bachelet. The former president of Chile was elected into office twice. Before leading her country, she was health minister and the first female defense minister in Latin America. There are a lot of firsts in Bachelet's career, including being the original executive director of UN Women. She is now the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Michelle Bachelet, thank you for joining us.
Greetings to all of you. I'm glad to have this opportunity to contribute to an important and lively conversation. Globally, human rights are under serious threat, and strong and visionary activism can bring huge benefit to our world and humanity's future. Today, remarkable progress that has been made over decades in every region in decreasing conflict between states, reducing poverty, and expanding access to education and other rights is in jeopardy. The Russian Federation's military attack on Ukraine is putting at risk tens of millions of lives. Heightened nuclear threat underscore the risk to all humanity. Depleted by the pandemic, divided by growing polarization, undermined by growing environmental harm and disregard for the rule of law, and corroded by digital disinformation, hatred, and distortions of democracy, many societies are evolving or plunging into increased repression and violence, rising poverty, anger, and violent tensions. But every major crisis is an opening for transformative change. In my view, both the pandemic and climate change have been and continue to be a very stark demonstration of where those changes need to be made and what they should be. They force us to reckon with injustice, inequalities, and entrenched discrimination of every type. And they make it clear how badly we need to fix them. Fortunately, we have a vaccine. I don't only mean the medical vaccines that have the power to safeguard us from the worst impact of COVID-19. If world leaders act in solidarity to enable their distribution and accessibility for all human beings. I mean a vaccine against injustice, a vaccine against poverty and inequalities, a vaccine against tensions and conflict, underdevelopment, and environmental catastrophe. This vaccine was developed after horrific global shocks, including 2 world wars and a devastating global financial crisis. Human rights are that vaccine. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was agreed in 1948 and the great body of subsequent international human rights treaties, laws, and recommendations constitute very practical and focused guidance to shape policy that prevents and resolves crises. These human rights norms are a tested and immediately actionable body of guidance for us to rebuild from the pandemic, effectively address climate change, and advance more peaceful societies in which development benefits everyone. The pandemic is unraveling years of precious progress. In terms of the right to education, personal safety, basic economic security, decent work, adequate shelter and food, and of course the right to health, the damage that is being done to human rights is of a magnitude and speed the world has rarely seen. Generation upon generation of deprivation and injustice shape the fractures that both the pandemic and our global environmental crisis have amplified. Discrimination, brutality, and harassment on the basis of race or sex are deeply embedded in our societies, and they will not go away with a few empty gestures. From my own experience and from the lessons of history, I am convinced that everyone's participation in decision-making is not only a right, it is also key to rebuilding a safer and more peaceful world. Last year, my office issued an agenda for transformative change for racial justice and equality, focusing on Africans and people of African descent. Its purpose is to end systemic racism and end impunity for violations by law enforcement officials, ensure the voices of people of African descent are heard, and repair the legacies of the past. States have the primary responsibility to concretely advance the anti-racism agenda. But if we are to successfully dismantle systemic racism, we also need greater activism to ensure that all voices can be heard and can help to shape policy. Social protections are another key issue. We need to change the economic approaches that have produced such unbearable social cost, tearing apart the fabric of our societies and amplifying mistrust towards institutions. It is clear that everyone will benefit in a world where all children, all adults have their basic needs met, where unemployment, injury, ill health, old age, or disability do not signal misery and hardship, where people are not left unprotected in times of crisis and disaster. The pandemic has also generated a sharply rising global economic divergence. Developing and least developed countries are not recovering at the same rapid pace as the developed world, in part due to vaccine inequity, which is morally, politically, and economically unacceptable. Other factors in this global economic divergence include debt burdens, capital flight, and corruption. We are already seeing that high debt service payments are crowding out investment in rights such as health, social protection, a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and education that are essential to sustainable recovery. A recent study indicated that reductions in social spending are likely in 83 out of 189 countries by 2023, potentially affecting the human rights of 2.3 billion people. So we need to exercise far greater solidarity. We need economies and societies that are people and planet-centered and which work for everyone. All human beings are born equal in dignity and rights, and it is actively harmful to both the individuals concerned and to all our societies to neglect or ignore human rights violations that hold people back and create deep-seated grievances. We need everyone's assistance. We need your activism, your energy, your creativity, and your legwork. Please help us stand up for human rights. Thank you.
Ukrainians will tell you that they have been at war with Russia since 2014. 2 years ago, Ukrainian youngsters impacted by the conflict worked with UNICEF to create an appeal for the war to end. Their poems for peace are as relevant today as when they were first recorded. Let's take a look.
Я вже давно не маленька і навчилася розрізняти, як природні громи співають і як страшно кричать гармати.
Десь там біліє стара хата, така мала і самотна, а там хлоп'як питає тата, чому до нас прийшла війна?
Тихо светит, звезды далеко, темнота спускается повсюду. Снова ночь, передо мной окно, и смотреть в него я снова буду.
Вагони помчали під пострілів в такт. Слова прозвучали, але вже не так. Цілунки, обійми, не ті вже, не ті. І очі до болю далекі, чужі.
Земля від жаху тихо помирала, згасала, як остання свічка на столі. Безжальний дощ оплакував людські грехи, а люди мовчки все приймали, бо каяття не вистачало.
Моя мечта проста или нелепа? Проснуться там, где больше страхов нет. Нам снится мир, тепло руки и запах хлеба, и трели птиц, встречающих рассвет.
Теперь мы больше ценим тишину. Возможность ночью спать, не думая о взрыве. Ходить к друзьям, что без контрольного звонка. Все хорошо, дошли, уже в квартире.
Не вижу там ни крови, ни смертей. Не вижу я военных эшелонок. Лишь только много зелени степей. Среди травы цветы, а не патроны.
Желайте мира всем, поступки, разум, порыв души кричат. Пусть утро будет тихое, а небо ясное.
Мир не будують 2 чи 3 людини, бо мир у силі кожної родини. Хай миру птах здіймається у небо, життя у злагоді загальна всіх потреба.
Think about how we're taking part in this closing plenary. We are on devices, and many of us have tech that's sophisticated enough to capture important moments in our lives. There are so many tools to record history as it happens, but how do we preserve it in a reliable, credible way, and a way that ensures we continue learning the lessons of the past? Using the most advanced technology, Jonathan Dotan and his team at the Starling lab have come up with a method to preserve critical history and make it available for us to access with just a mobile phone. There is a lot to learn about this project. Jonathan joins us to share more.
I'd like to dedicate this talk today to my grandfather because he would have loved this story. And so instead I'll share it with you. And as I tell you the story, I'd like to invite you to ponder this question. Whose story is this? Now, our story begins with a number, 69,388. And if you're wondering what that number is, well, you might go to the internet and you might type in a search engine the number and see what type of results you get. So with that search, here's what you might find. A cobalt blue beehive lamp, ID 69388. Or this handy dandy Bosch fuel pump, item 69388. Or even a beautiful set of designs for a Southwest style house, design 69388. But our story, it isn't about any of those things. In this story, that number was given to an 18-year-old girl named Anita. It's not a number she chose or even thought much about until a very, very cold morning in December of 1943. You see, Anita had been waiting in a long line with other women and girls for what was known as the welcoming ceremony at the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. There, Anita was stripped naked, her head was shaved, and a young girl was standing there before her, hands trembling, lifted up a pen with a needle on the end of it. And as neatly as she could, the young girl inscribed 5 digits into Anita's left forearm, which began to swell and bleed. 6, 9, 3, 8, 8. In the space of a few minutes, Anita said, I had been stripped of every vestige of human dignity and become indistinguishable from everyone around me. She was no longer a person. She was a number. And as far as the Nazis were concerned, that number, it told them everything that they needed to know about Anita, her entire life story reduced to just 5 digits. And best of all, that number could track the living and the dead. But that number wasn't Anita. It was a lie. One of the many lies of hatred and prejudice that formed anti-Semitism that brought Anita to the very gates of Auschwitz. And in today's internet, Web 2.0, many of these same lies, they continue to proliferate in a powerful web of misinformation and mistrust. The lies are recommended to you as the next video to watch or the top of a search result. Innovation has outpaced wisdom, as big data and big platforms have grown so big that they've overwhelmed the truth. And left unchecked, well, tomorrow the web could be filled with even more lies. Imagine what that might look like for a minute. Deepfake videos in which Holocaust survivors' words and their likeness are manipulated to prove that somehow the Holocaust never happened. That could be our future. So, what are we going to do about that? Looking at the alternatives, it's at once inspiring and also daunting. You see, the internet is evolving at a breakneck speed right before our eyes. And you may have heard about all the buzz about technologies like blockchains or Bitcoin or NFTs. Together, they're part of a larger set of technologies that are really trying to reshape and improve the internet as we know it into what people are calling the decentralized web, moving us from Web 2.0 of today to Web 3. At my lab at Stanford and the USC Shoah Foundation, we are working with technologists, historians, journalists, and lawyers to seize this opportunity to leverage and shape Web 3. There's a lot to do, but we believe that there's a clear and an intuitive and attainable starting point. Use Web 3 to preserve the integrity of the world's most sensitive and vulnerable data. We're starting with 55,000 testimonies from those who have survived genocide. These testimonies bear witness from survivors of the Holocaust and 13 additional genocide collections spanning Armenia, Cambodia, Rwanda, and they also look at mass atrocities unfolding today in Myanmar and Ukraine. As we speak, we are in the process of uploading the full 4 petabytes of this archive onto the decentralized internet. It's a new kind of backup. And from what had been stored in just 3 locations, well, now we're putting an additional backup copy on the archive onto hundreds of servers, and soon thousands. all on the next version of the internet. This effort is the largest ingestion of data onto the D-Web in the world. And the first testimony that is on the D-Web, well, it's from Anita. Over 2 hours of her telling her story. We take Anita's testimony and we chop it up into thousands of little pieces, and then we distribute those to servers all over the world. And as we distribute the files, we use math to prove that even though the pieces are out of our control, they haven't been changed, they haven't been tampered with, that they remain authentic. Now, the way we mark this authenticity is by assigning Anita's video a unique number. It's a unique seal, a unique stamp of the video's authenticity. Tamper with the video, the seal is broken. But from what authority do we trust to generate this stamp of authenticity? What authority ensures that this number is unique? Well, we could take the stamp from a centralized authority, like say how the Nazi government centrally defined the number that was tattooed on Anita's arm. And well, surely that doesn't seem right. Instead, we use a different type of number. It's one that is intrinsically authentic and unique because it's actually derived from Anita herself. It's from her voice. What we do is we take every bit of data from Anita's video and we pass it through a one-way algorithm. This results in a unique, persistent number. It's a hash. But not just a regular hash, it's a content ID that is optimized so that you have a resilient identifier that represents each file no matter where it lives. And you don't need Google to find it, or Amazon to host it, or Facebook to share it. Well, that number, it can endure all on its own without any company. And with a CID on the D-Web, you'll always be able to find Anita's exact testimony, plus you'll have a record of its origin, its authenticity. And therefore, its wisdom is intact. For Anita's video has a universe of wisdom and answers so many of the questions that we have about her and her experience. Like, for instance, what was she before she came to Auschwitz? In fact, that's the very question that she was asked right after being given her tattoo. The girl processing her registration casually asked Anita, "What did you do before the war?" Without thinking, Anita answered, "I was a cellist." "You must wait here," the girl says. So Anita stands there, naked, holding just a toothbrush. And looking up, she sees the showers overhead. And as the room empties out, she's suddenly alone, and she's heard the rumors about the gas chambers. And so she thinks to herself, well, this is it. But after a few minutes, the girl returns with a surprisingly well-dressed prisoner who begins peppering Anita with all sorts of different questions, all of them about the cello. This prisoner is the conductor of the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, and the orchestra needs a cellist. Several days later, an SS guard arrives to take Anita to an audition, and he doesn't ask for prisoner 69388. "Bring me the cellist," he asks instead. And then, for the first time in 2 years, Anita holds a cello in her hands. And it takes a minute for her fingers to reacquaint themselves with the strings. And she starts her audition by playing this piece, the Adagio of Boccherini's Cello Concerto No. 9. Anita would play with the orchestra each morning for thousands of inmates marching to work and to their death. She would play for officers like Joseph Mengele and the Angel of Death, who personally demanded for Anita's solo. This piece, it helped her survive the inferno, and miraculously, it helped Anita also save the life of her sister, who arrived at Auschwitz just a few weeks later. Think about it. Just this piece has saved lives. As Anita said, Hitler destroyed so much, but music is indestructible. At the lab, we were so moved by these words, and soon they became not just an article of faith, but a roadmap for our next prototype. If you go to starlinglab.org/Anita, you'll find a file that you can download. It's this rendition of Anita's audition piece, as played by Yo-Yo Ma. It's his gift to you, a musical tribute to Anita's incredible story. Working with Yo-Yo Ma and his team, we looked at this recording and we reimagined it as a vessel. Already, it contains, through the language of music, Anita's experience, but now there's something else. In the header of each music file, we embedded the content ID of Anita's video testimony. Remember, that's that unique number that preserves her video on Web3. And that might seem like the most unlikely place to store a CID, but actually it's the safest because of who downloads it and why. At the beginning of this talk, I asked you, whose story is this? And well, surely it's Anita's, but by downloading this prototype file, now it's your story. And it's your story. And your story. It's our story. Each of us and all of us, we now hold Anita's precious number, her CID. We are the keepers of the authenticity of her testimony, and therefore we are now all part of Web3. Download the file, and you become a node on the Web3 internet. And we have everything that we need. And that's what most people miss. When they think about the decentralized web, they focus on the network and all the trustless connections within it. But for me, they always start with the nodes themselves and the hashes that they create. I see them for what they are. Not a number in a crypto wallet, not a record of a transaction in a DAO, or the number that represents an NFT. At its core, a hash on Web3 is the expression of humans. And I believe that the new web will only truly begin when we bring this sense of purpose and humanity. Not unbridled optimism, not quick fixes, but look, don't take my word for it. Take it from Anita. She's 96 years old, she's alive and well. Her story is now part of the foundation of the decentralized web. And as she said, it's not about numbers, it's about people.
It's important that people identify with people when we talk about the Holocaust, because I always feel this idea of 6 million dead people is totally futile. Nobody can, there's no concept of that. But the generation that come after us, if they talk about the Holocaust and just think of 6 million people, it becomes a dead territory. And I think these interviews are important for the people to see that we were actually people, and totally normal people, and nothing wrong with us, coming from totally normal families, being reduced to what we were reduced to, which led to this unprecedented mass murder that the Holocaust is.
Having access to healthcare and equitable health services is a human right that we're about to explore with three very special doctors. Dr. Alaa Murabit is a women's rights advocate, global health and security expert, and strategist. Dr. Joya Mukherjee is the Chief Medical Officer for Partners in Health. And Dr. Githinji Gitahi is the Group Chief Executive Officer of Amref Health Africa. The discussion is moderated by Zainab Salbi, founder of Women for Women International and co-founder of Daughters for Earth.
Before we start the discussion, I really want to take a moment to honor the life and the teachings of Dr. Paul Farmer. I tear up as I just think about him. As you all know, he's a strong and uncompromising champion for dignity and healthcare for everyone, everywhere. Paul wasn't afraid to clash with big institutions who were focused on cost effectiveness or moved too slowly. He was beloved by many. He's a friend, husband, father, and he was most definitely beloved a lot by a member of the Skoll community, whose work reinforced the need to give global healthcare access and equity its own spotlight at the forum. Now, I know each one of you are champions yourself, and I feel like sometimes the best way to honor those who have passed on in life is to honor their legacy and what they have taught us about life. And as I think about the conversation today, each one of you have that continue that legacy with your commitment to equality and access to all healthcare. So I want to start with a basic question, actually, which is, what started you off? How did you get here? And I want to start with Alaa. Can you start us off with a brief description of what impacted your journey so far?
Oh, I'm happy to. In short, I'm the daughter of immigrants, and health. Medicine is one of few avenues where they feel there is security. But beyond that, my dad was actually a doctor, and my dad left Libya, where my parents and I are originally from, in the early 1980s and moved to Canada. And I would often go. I have 10 brothers and sisters. So I joke that my after school activity was to go to the hospital and to study in the library and to work there while my dad was working. And so I spent a lot of my formative years in a hospital. And I would argue that it is, to me, you hear more prayers and whispered negotiations in the chapel room of a hospital than I've heard in mosques and synagogues and churches all over. To me, it is the single most spiritual place. It is where people truly show up for each other. And so I've always had a strong belief, and I think the world now shares that in these past couple of years, that if people are healthy, people have the agency to do everything else. But to add to that quickly, just in respect with Dr. Farmer, I had always looked at medicine from a provider-patient perspective. And it wasn't until after I started my women's rights organization and I really started looking at how we can shift things on a more community level that I began to explore that even in medicine. And my thesis that I wrote in 2016 was on pandemic response in countries and how and Dr. Paul Farmer's work, I think, was referenced more than anyone else's throughout it. And so he was a very pivotal actor in me beginning to shift my perception of how healthcare has been used historically in many countries and how we can use it differently now and how we can ensure that it's provided for differently now to really provide countries and people with those basic rights and dignities.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Alaa. Thank you. I want to go now to Joya, which first I want to give my personal condolences at the passing of Dr. Farmer. And you worked with him, but before describing that relationship, I wonder what impacted you personally in your life to be a chief medical officer at Partners at Health.
Yeah. Thank you, Zainab. So, I also am the daughter of an immigrant, not two. My mom is a Euro-American from Chicago, but my father immigrated from India to the United States in the 1950s. I didn't understand very much about his home country nor his home city of Calcutta or the circumstances that made him want to leave. And then at 8 years old, my family, I have just a brother and a sister, we traveled to Calcutta, and it was 1972, which was the end of the War of Independence between Bangladesh and Pakistan. And it was the largest refugee crisis in the 20th century. 10 million people were displaced and moving between West and East Bengal. And of course, Calcutta, as the largest city in that region, was home to many, many people fleeing the violence and the war. And in fact, India was under a national emergency, but my parents kind of took us anyway. And they weren't activists. My dad was an engineer and my mom was an English teacher. They just took us there to see our family, my dad's many brothers and sisters and cousins we had never met. But being born in the US and raised in suburban Long Island, it was an absolute shock to me. And I think I was just at that age. Children have a deep sense of social justice, I think. And it was just at that age where I could remember enough and see my own self in many of the children who were on the streets begging, many of the children who were laying across the laps of their mother, asking for alms. My father's family lives right near the major temple in Calcutta, and so many people were congregated there begging. And many of them were very sick, particularly with leprosy. And I was, moved by that and scared as an 8-year-old and asked my parents, so how did that person get to look like that? And, my mom, I remember saying, well, that person has leprosy. And I said, can I catch it? And she said, no, only poor people get leprosy. And I think that realization just sort of broke something in me about my suburban comfort, that like I had privilege and I didn't have a name for it at age 8, but I think for the rest of my life, I saw the world as very different. It was really hard to come back to the level of privilege and not remember those things in a kind of nightmarish sort of way. And I really, when I got to college, it was the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And I think I understood that AIDS quickly was going to become like leprosy, like tuberculosis, that it would be a condition that would consign people to be othered. And we saw that in the United States with the gay community, but it was rapidly spreading throughout Africa. So when I went to medical school, I thought I'm going to be an AIDS doctor. And no one wanted to be an AIDS doctor there because it was just like ministering to the dying. There was no treatment. This is in the early 90s, late 80s. And I stumbled upon a tiny organization called Partners in Health that was brave enough to treat a handful of patients in Haiti. And I said, I'll work for you for free. That was 24 years ago. But we started treating people not only with the drugs, but with food and housing and school fees for their children, understanding that AIDS was tracking along the lines of, marginalization and, and Paul's bravery and Partners in Health too. Many of my Haitian colleagues, particularly, they said, we're just going to do this. People aren't going to like it. We were criticized by the academy, told we were gold plated, not sustainable, all those things. But luckily, in this case, Zainab, about optimism, we were talking about, the world took notice and did the right thing. And I think it was pressure from civil society groups. It was people living with AIDS themselves. It was really amazing African leaders like Dr. Gatahi. So many people said, no. If they can do it in Haiti, we can do it over here. And we became part of a much larger movement that superseded the previous nihilism.
And it's a story of the triumph of hope. When we go out and do something we believe in, at the beginning it may be hard, but eventually it does thrive. It does get heard eventually. And with that, Dr. Kathani, I'm so interested in hearing your story and how you got to where you are today.
Well, thank you very much. And I tend to consider myself a product of chance, actually. How so? I won the lottery 52 years ago, being born to a peasant mother, as her 8th child. But the lottery I won is that though she was illiterate, she gave birth to me and my siblings in the village in Kenya, about 200 kilometers out of Nairobi. without shoes, without electricity, no piped water, on a small piece of land. She believed that feeding her children and taking them to school was the most important thing she could do. And that's the lottery I won, because when I look back and I see the neighbors, the young children we went to school with, who didn't win that lottery of having a mother who believed that nutrition and education was important for them, I left them way behind. And it still breaks my heart to know that it was so simple. It was nutrition and it was education. So that's the lottery I won 52 years ago, that my mother bothered to breastfeed me for 6 months and to take me to school against all odds. And then when I grew up, and because of that nutrition, I don't remember any special training. I just went on and I passed school, I passed exams, and I landed in medical school. But when I landed in medical school is when I realized that actually that I met other people I hadn't met before, because now I came to the capital city and I meet people who are from middle class and high income, and I start to realize that actually the opposite of poverty is not wealth, because I wasn't there because we were wealthy. I realized that the opposite of poverty is justice. And what I had and what brought me to this platform was that my mother gave me justice. And justice was that she offered me the thing that I needed to build my human capital that others didn't get. They didn't get to build their human capital. And it wasn't, justice could be denied by commission, but it could also be, denied by omission. Where the people who are taking care of our communities are not aware and they don't have the means, and they're living under what we call structural violence. And that is what it brings to this platform, building human capital through justice, through equity.
It's so inspiring that all of you, I mean, you're talking about the opposite of poverty as justice. Alaa talks about higher power in the hospital rooms. Julia talk about the triumph of hope. It's so beautiful, even though you're all in these powerful positions, that we need to go back to this essential quality in human lives. And with that, I want to, go into the institutional now, and I want to start with Alaa. In both your capacity with the UN as well as with the Gates Foundation, what does the global community need to do differently now, in your opinion, especially as we're still struggling through this pandemic?
I actually think it's listening to local communities. That is something that we don't do well enough in global health. Oftentimes we determine what is the biggest challenge for a population, and then we determine how we're going to fix it. And we go and we consult with the local community. And I think we really need to do this differently, because the people that are most impacted, the people that are closest to the challenge, the people that live through this every day, those local leaders are the ones who have to actually implement in those moments of conflict, in those moments of inequality, in those moments of crisis. And very frankly, they're the ones who have credibility with the local community. They're the ones who have that inherent buy-in, and they're the ones who can bring those issues to light. And so I really think it is putting the local first. And it's interesting because it took a global pandemic for us to realize that we are collectively as strong as the weakest, healthcare link. And so we need to be able to build resilient healthcare systems around the world. And the only people who can do that are the people who live there, work there, and are going to be the ones who implement that in the long term.
Thank you, Alaa. I want to take it back to Julia. Where have we failed? And what kind of leadership is needed at times, in times of crisis like the one we are dealing with right now? What can we do to do it differently in the future?
Yeah, I loved what Gitanji said about justice. And I think where we failed is that we don't understand that inequities mirror our injustice. And health is just a thermometer for that injustice. Health is, if you look at the life expectancy in my hometown of Boston, if you take the subway from Roxbury Crossing to Back Bay, the life expectancy drops about 30 years. That's not genetic. That's not biological. That is about the legacy of racism, of all of the things that come along with that: housing, job security, schooling, etc. And so the way to really decrease that 30-year gap is by resourcing for equity, right? And so to me, where we failed is we look at inequity as somehow behavioral. Well, people that you find loads of these programs in behavioral health, like teach people to exercise and eat better food, but that is not the root cause. So I think we as elites have been lulled into this idea that we're healthy and wealthy because we're smarter, because we make better choices. And that's not the case. The data does not bear that out. That is not evidence-based. And so I think one of the most important lessons to me in health equity is to achieve health equity, we have to put the resources in to deal with the inequities. Again, whether it's food, housing, whether it's school, these things are going to improve health. And of course, people need healthcare. But if you don't address those, what are called social determinants of health, which to me are social, economic, and political forces, they're not determinants. They have a direction and a magnitude, right? They're vectors. So if we don't push back on those directions and magnitudes of oppression, we cannot have health equity.
Those social determinants actually make up the bulk of our healthcare reality. And so people's health is not defined by brick and mortar hospitals, or that's actually makes up 10 to 20%. The bulk of it is based on those social determinants and those political, social, economic forces. So completely agree that that's where we need to start.
Thank you, Dr. Katanji. I want to come back to you about the international in the international development system, and how it has traditionally been fairly utilitarian, do the most good for the most people at the lowest cost. How might a focus on equity shift how we think about healthcare and delivery?
This is really the crux of the matter. And I think this is what both Jaya and Alaa are talking about, that first, health is made where the people are. That's where health is made. It's not made in the hospital. The hospitals are the places we repair when things go wrong. And I think when I remember Paul Farmer, Jaya, we share the laws, because I think Paul is one person who understood this concept very well, that health is made where people are. And the one thing I want to reflect on international health delivery system, and I say something probably a bit controversial, is that I value the data that is most valuable to me is lived experiences. It's not peer-reviewed published data.
Amen.
And
Amen.
Yes, and that is what international health system follows. As long as it's published in the Harvard Review, then that's what we are going to do. And when the local organizations are actually programming for health, they are told, give us references. Where was it published? Include references. Can I reference my mother who breastfed me for 6 months, brought up 9 children, they're all alive and they are healthy? I can't reference her because she's not published. So the question is, equity will depend on us actually serving the people who actually understand and the people that actually need the services that we are trying to deliver. And that will not fit into that mechanism of just, give the most people, the most good at the lowest cost, because then the context is different. The context of providing antenatal care to a woman who lives in an extremely paternalistic society where her husband needs to give permission to go for antenatal care will be very different from where you're dealing with an urban center, or where the woman is, the health center is next door. The woman in Ethiopia, in Afar or Somalia, or in in a rural village of Malawi, or called Mzuzu, will need to travel and probably sleep on the way to find antenatal care. So we need to look at this. We need to actually contextualize, and we can only contextualize if we are closest to this problem we are trying to solve. Because you know what? The communities have the solution.
We are almost out of time, so I want to close it with asking you all one question, which is, this work is, you're obviously very passionate about the work. You put all your life and dedicated your life for that. And yet I know it is very hard, and it can take a toll on you sometimes, as you have to negotiate and compromise and deal with the injustices and the inequality of it all. So my basic question, and if we can just do a quick answer for each, what gives you hope?
Well, I think it's two things. It is others in this space, like that, like this panel, that are honestly talking about the same things and saying we need to do things differently, and we really need to spotlight and focus on local leadership and work with community. And as you were talking about your mother, I was thinking about my grandmom. My grandma was the same. She was illiterate. She got married very young. She had my dad. And she ended up passing away before her 25th birthday because she had an undiagnosed condition and she didn't have access to care. And there are millions of people who face that today around the world. And I do think about, my dad would also say he lived a lucky life. And he's had a lot of opportunities and a lot of chances that others didn't have. But it does make me wonder, if we were really able to deliver to communities and to ensure that all people had access to care, how many more people would there be who get to go on to become vice chancellors and heads of medical agencies? And I mean, how much are we missing out on? And I think that's something that keeps me going.
Thank you. Julia?
Mine is very short. It's the growing movement of people who care. It's just that growing movement.
It's beautiful. And Dr. Kuthinchi, the last word is to you.
Wow, that's it. That's it. It's that change is possible. Change is possible because we are testimonies that change is possible. And I think if we are testimonies that change is possible, then why should we give up?
Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful, beautiful. I have to say that I leave the session inspired and with a stronger heart than I started it, and uplifted, and knowing that there are people like you who keep the fight going, who keep it going, and you're carrying the message with so much love and so much care and so much kindness and compassion. And so I thank you for that. And I'm sure everyone will be as inspired by you as I have. Thank you, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Zainab.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
We are wrapping up our closing plenary lineup with Mali's super duo, Amadou and Mariam. I cannot count the number of gold and platinum discs they've collected for their work. They are one of Mali's greatest musical exports. Married for over 40 years, the couple met back in the 1970s at an institute for the blind. They've been collaborating ever since in life and in music. Mariam says their goal as musicians is to make people happy with their music, help humanitarian causes, and share positive messages about the good work being done by people in every corner of the world. Now you know why we invited them to the Skoll World Forum. Trust me, it is hard to get tickets to see Amadou and Mariam perform. They sell out everywhere. We have just snagged VIP seats. Enjoy.
Salut, c'est Amadou et Mariam. Merci à tous de nous rejoindre au Forum mondial Skoll de ces derniers jours.
Alors, nous allons jouer un morceau qui s'appelle
Batoma.
On y va.
Chaud, 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 chaud. Batoma. Chaud, 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 souvent. fous. Moi que toma toi kasi kadafara.
Moi je m'en fous.
Mamuso toma toka kasi kadafara.
Moi je m'en fous.
Murenge du toma toka kasi kadafara.
Moi je m'en fous.
Muramuso du toma toka kasi kadafara.
Moi je m'en fous.
Nyuma wani du toma toka kasi kadafara.
Moi je m'en fous.
Asina muso du toma toka kasi kadafara.
Moi je m'en fous.
Batoma nene me kasi la ye me samafu. On chantait, on dansait, on tchatchait, on bougeait, moi je m'en fous. Aye demisenu mbamu, ka demisenu chuchu, be ka demisenu ladia, ka demisenu nege. Aye demisenu mbamu, ka demisenu chuchu, be ka demisenu la nege, ka demisenu nanana. Chuchu, de mbamu, de jaso, de chuchu. Chuchu, de mbamu, de jaso. De nani, eba, chuchuchu, de mbamu, de nani, de mbamu, chuchuchu, de mbamu, de nani, chuchuchu, sindwada, sindwada. Yeah.
Alors, le second morceau que nous allons vous jouer s'appelle Beau
Beau
Dimanche ou Dimanche à Bamako. On y va.
Show, 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 show.
Les dimanches à Bamako, c'est les jours de mariage. Les dimanches à Bamako, c'est les jours de mariage. Les dimanches à Bamako, c'est les jours de mariage. Les djemés et les dounous résonnent partout. Les balas et les tamas résonnent partout. La kora et le goni sont aussi au rendez-vous. Les dimanches à Bamako, c'est les jours de mariage. Les dimanches à Bamako, c'est les jours de mariage. Les parents et les sympathisants sont au rendez-vous. Les copains et les voisins sont au rendez-vous. Les founais et les djidis sont aussi au rendez-vous. Les dimanches à Bamako, c'est les jours de mariage. Les dimanches à Bamako, c'est les jours de mariage. Les hommes et les femmes ont mis les beaux boubous. Les bijoux et les chaussures sont au rendez-vous. Les bazins et les bogolas sont au rendez-vous. La mariée et le marié sont aussi au rendez-vous. Les dimanches à Bamako, c'est les jours de mariage. Les sotaramas, les dounis, les taxis et les voitures, les frères, les sœurs, les badauds et les griots. Les dimanches à Bamako, c'est les jours de mariage. 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 C'est les jours de mariage.
The theme that brought us together this year was the idea of facing our challenges together, unflinching, face forward. In the past 2 days, I hope that you have found the strength, inspiration, and connections you need to forge ahead with your work in 2022. This forum was brought to you by a team, and I am going to take a moment to thank them. Program participants, you're the best. Skoll partners, we salute you. Thanks to Empire Entertainment, Caspian Agency, Oxford Digital Media, there'd be no forum without you. Thank you, Skoll Centre for Social Entrepreneurship, participant, and the entire extended Skoll family and friends who made this forum possible. But this is not the end, because Ecosystem Day is coming up tomorrow. The Skoll World Forum Network is about to shine, as our community has designed a program of over 100 events. Come back to this platform on Friday to spend the day with social entrepreneurs, innovators, and change makers. It's going to be so good. But for now, this plenary is closed. Thank you for being part of it. Take care.